In his later eponymous work, Works of Love, Kierkegaard develops a philosophy of love, influenced by the biblical commandment to love one's neighbor. As Kierkegaard's, at times, anti-Hegelian philosophy is a response to the crisis of Christianity of his own day, it is impossible to engage with Kierkegaard without some theological explorations, first on the nature of this commandment, before proceeding to the philosophy of love and education present there. A number of works have been written on the philosophy of love in Kierkegaard. Most notably, you can see Evans, Hall, and Strasser. However, a lot of those writings focus on the later stages of Kierkegaard's authorship. I do not support the view that Kierkegaard's development as a writer and a move from pseudonymous to orthonymous work constitutes a change in his idea. Rather, his later works are an expansion of the earlier themes while still staying true to them. Therefore, it would be beneficial to investigate the philosophy of love as developed in the early authorship of Kierkegaard. While Michael Strasser argues that Kierkegaard is and always have been a philosopher of love, I argue that he is and always has been an educational thinker. The aim of this paper is to unite the themes of love and education to develop a distinctly Kierkegaardian philosophy of love as education in his early authorship. Which commandment is the first of all? Jesus answered, the first is, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your mind, and with all your strength. The second is this, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. There is no other commandment greater than these. Mark chapter 12, verses 28 to 34. Usually just one verse from the above quotation of the Gospel of Mark is used most widely, that of you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Christian commentators seem to emphasize the relationship between loving the neighbor and loving God, and say nothing of as yourself. It is possible to read the above in two ways. A, to assume that we can love our neighbor because we know what it means to love ourselves, and B, that we cannot love our neighbor because we do not love ourselves enough. It is not my purpose to evaluate which reading is better, but to focus on a specific aspect of the first reading that is supposed to be realized in the second reading, that of being able to know to love ourselves. Before we can relate in love to an other, the person or the subject matter, an individual has to come to a possession of knowledge of a relation of themselves to themselves. This relation is also a love. Aldous Huxley stated with an emphasis on knowledge, I quote, we can only love what we know, and we can never know completely what we do not love. Love is a mode of knowledge. End of quote. While Kierkegaard, with an emphasis on love, quote, I maintain that a person does not truly love until he knows what he loves. End of quote. In a way, this paper is situated in a philosophical tradition coming from an injunction inscribed at Delphic Oracle to know thyself. Ursula Reins, in her 2017 edited volume Self-Knowledge History, is an illuminating study on how the Delphic know thyself has been approached through the Western tradition up to contemporary times. Reins argues that the idea of know thyself or self-knowledge can be understood both as being knowledge itself and being about knowledge. For Reins, this duality of understanding has come from Plato and Socrates to preoccupy philosophers and is what accounts for contesting opinions on what self-knowledge is. For me, this duality seems to be evident in the opposition inherent in the Apology and Phaedrus following Camtaker. In the Apology, Socrates states that he knew himself not to be the wisest and therefore went to examine other wise people, while in Phaedrus he states that he still does not know himself as per inscription. Socrates states, I quote from Phaedrus, I can't as yet know myself as the inscription at Delphi enjoins. Whether I really am a more complex creature and more puffed up with pride and Typhon, or a simpler, gentle being. Nigel Tubbs argues for Plato, to know something is to be changed in the knowing, thus know thyself can never know the in itself. Meaning that as one asks about knowledge, the knowledge itself is changed, and the cycle repeats itself. One can never achieve the know thyself, and this is why it has a double meaning as pointed out by Reins above. Or as Tubbs puts it, to quote, this is to know and not to know at the same time, and the philosopher becomes like a child begging for both, reference Plato, the unchangeable and the changeable, end of quote. Kierkegaard himself makes a simpler argument with reference to Phaedrus in Philosophical Fragments. In an unfinished and an unpublished work of Kierkegaard, Johannes Climacus or De Omnibus Debutandum Est, the hero of the story, Johannes Climacus, is said to be in love with thinking. Unlike with the relationship to a person or a subject matter which are in an outside relation to the individual, thinking is internal to them. The movement of relation is not outward to an other, but inward to oneself. The narrative of Johannes Climacus is that ever since Johannes was a little child, he was and remained a stranger in the world, and he practically never went out of his home. His education was offered to him by his father in play, to quote, where they should go for a walk of the omnipotent imagination, end of quote. And when Johannes would overhear his father's conversation with the visitors to their house, where, quote, his father combined an irresistible dialectic with an omnipotent imagination, end of quote. When Johannes grew up, quote, the least significant and the most significant things tempted him alike as points of departure for his pursuits. For him, the result was not important, only the process interested him, end of quote. The book then proceeds to deal with the investigation of the three theses with relation to doubt and the beginning of philosophy. I do not wish to proceed to that, as the quotation above indicated. It is the process and not the result that interested Johannes himself, therefore I will do likewise. The process is thinking. The reason for thinking is the love of it. An objection with regard to the above is, did not the observation of the father's dialectical method, as well as play that led to the development of Johannes' imagination, act as his teacher? Then the love could be explained with regards to the love towards his father and the subject matter or the content of their play. With regards to the love towards the subject matter, I have already quoted Kierkegaard stating that it was the process, the play in itself, if you wish, rather than the content of the play that was the object of love. For Johannes and his father, the play was thinking. Therefore, it is the thinking that Johannes loved and not what he was thinking about. Johannes certainly seemed to love his father. However, the love for thinking transcended the love for his father. In the book, Johannes employs the method of philosophy he is arguing against in order to successfully disprove it by itself. Implications for philosophers, or the teachers, are that they must be sacrificed. Kierkegaard argues the teacher, by the virtue of teaching the students, hands the student a sword with which they must kill the teacher, otherwise the student has not learned anything. Consequence of this for the student, as soon as they took up the sword, they must be prepared to also be slain in the future. What Kierkegaard means by this teacher-student relationship is that education is difficult. Here the difficulty is expressed by the metaphor of death. For Johannes, there also appears a moment in the story with regards to a break with his own father. Quote, it was a long time before it dawned on him that his father contradicted himself. End of quote. The relationship with the father is broken. Johannes' education has to proceed on his own. What sustains such education is love. In the two upbuilding discourses published around the same time as Johannes Climacus, Kierkegaard argues that when we love another person, we wish them all the good and all the perfect gifts. However, quote, if by my wishing or by my gift I could bestow upon him the highest good, he said, then I could also take it from him, even if he would not have to be afraid of that. Worse yet, if I could do that, then the very moment I gave it to him, I would be taking it from him, since by giving him the highest, I would be depriving him of the highest, because the highest was that he could give it to himself. End of quote. The implications are that the teacher is unable to provide the student with education. It would be depriving them from an opportunity to gain it for themselves. The study of love in Kierkegaard can take two directions, as already suggested at the beginning. I am concentrating on the early authorship, where primarily study for love would be the two volumes of Either Or. The other obvious choice would be the second half of the authorship and the works of love, published under Kierkegaard's own name. There is also a study by C. Stephen Evans that elaborates on the relationship between the self-love and neighbor love with relation to the works of love. However, in Either Or, Kierkegaard is using two Danish words for love, elskov and kærlighed. Elskov is an erotic love, the kind of love that Kierkegaard is using in his studies of seducers like Don Giovanni in the Moses Opera or Johannes the Seducer in the Seducer's Diary, which makes a part of the first volume of Either Or. Socrates as the seducer is also explored by Kierkegaard in his university dissertation. Kierkegaard describes Socratic seduction as follows, quote, he attracted youth to himself, but when they looked up to him, wanted to find a point of rest in him, wanted, forgetting all else, to seek reassurance in his love, wanted themselves to cease to be and to be only in being loved by him, then he was gone, the spell was broken, then they felt that they were deceived, that it was not Socrates who loved them, but they who loved Socrates. End of quote. It is necessary to ask at which moment does the seduction completes. Does seduction completes at the moment the seducer gets the seduced, or is it at the moment the seduced realizes they have been seduced? With Socrates above, the seduction completes when the seduced have realized they are not loved by the seducer and therefore they have been seduced. With Don Giovanni, the seduced Donna Elvira continues to love him, but at the same time understands that she is indebted to him. Quote, "No, I will hate him. Only in that way can I tear myself away from him and show myself that I do not need him. But am I not indebted to him at all when I hate him? Am I not living off him? For what is that nourishes my hatred except my love for him?" The kind of teacher Socrates represents is the one who gets what he wants from the student, makes them face the abyss and leaves them there. Johannes the seducer, however, gets Cordelia, but does not just move on like Don Giovanni or Socrates would, paying no respect to whether or not the seduced continues to love them. Johannes the seducer makes Cordelia break off the engagement. He goes an extra mile. This is important, as in Don Giovanni and in Socrates, the seduced belongs to the seducer in terms of love. The seducer, on the other hand, does not care about the seduced as soon as he gets what he wanted. With Johannes the seducer and Cordelia, the situation is different. Johannes the seducer belongs to Cordelia in a way she expresses it in her letter. Quote, "I do call you mine, my seducer, my deceiver, my enemy, my murderer, the source of my unhappiness, the tomb of my joy." End of quote. Yet also Cordelia belongs to him. Quote, "You have had the audacity to deceive a person in such a way that you have become everything to me, so that I would rejoice solely in being your slave." End of quote. Johannes the seducer knows that, quote, "When I have brought her to the point where she has learned what it is to love and what it is to love me, then the engagement will break like a defective mold and she will belong to me." End of quote. Ironically, she will only love him once she breaks off the engagement. It is of course possible to argue that in a way the argument that the seduced belongs to the seducer works with Socrates and Don Giovanni too. Indeed, but what is different is how the seducer comes into such possession. This is why I argue only Johannes the seducer's possession is true possession. Other seducers throw away their possession, the seduced, and this is how they come to gain a possession over them. Johannes the seducer makes Cordelia throw him away and therefore picks up the possession offered freely by Cordelia herself. However, quote, "But now it is finished and I never want to see her again," end of quote, says Johannes the seducer. This is the nature of Elskov. The above discussion demonstrates three instances of erotic love in action, where the relationship between the teacher and the student will leave the student facing the abyss, as in the case of Socrates, or being in the possession of the teacher due to their love and hate for them, as in Don Giovanni and Johannes the seducer. To come back to the Johannes from our story of Johannes Climacus, there is a possibility for this unequal relationship of dependence to be broken. Quote, "When the master positively orders the follower to do something, it is certainly easier for the follower, because then the teacher assumes the responsibility. The follower, however, thereby becomes a less perfect being, one who has life in another person. But by imposing something negative, the teacher emancipates the follower from himself, makes him just as important as himself. The relationship of teacher and follower is indeed cancelled." End of quote. The something negative above is the negation of the teacher. In the discussion of Johannes Climacus earlier, it was discussed in terms of taking up a sword and slaying the teacher. Yet, this negation of the teacher can be conceived in terms of focusing one's love not upon the teacher, but upon oneself. In the second volume of Either Or, Kierkegaard is developing a notion of shallyhead, a love evident in a marital relationship that encompasses Elskov and more. The more is undefined in Either Or. Surprisingly, however, shallyhead is most evident not in the choice between the two individuals, as in a marital relationship for example, but when one is choosing oneself. Kierkegaard differentiates between to know thyself and to choose oneself. In Either Or, a character called B states, quote, "I maintain that a person does not truly love until he knows what he loves." End of quote. Now, in a relationship such as marriage, one does not love oneself, but rather one loves the other, quote. And how is one to show this except by being only for the other, but how is one to be only for another except by not being for oneself, end of quote. It is then possible to know oneself in the other question. Yes, by virtue of shallyhead, but not Elskov. Character B anticipates character A's objection, quote, but one loses by disclosing oneself this way, end of quote. Losing one's privacy, some other material things, but more importantly, one is losing oneself. Quote, the person who loves, however, has lost himself in another, but in losing and forgetting himself in another, he is remembered in the other. End of quote. Kierkegaard references Matthew 10:39 that, quote, only the person who has lost everything has gained everything, end of quote. Thus one can know oneself but not choose oneself in the other. Kierkegaard develops an idea of a single individual, or a free individual, who has to choose oneself. This is, however, not a philosophical task. Kierkegaard discusses the difference between a philosopher and a free man. Quote, if the philosopher is only a philosopher, absorbed in philosophy, and knowing the blessed life of freedom, then he misses a very important point. He wins the whole world and loses himself. This can never happen to the person who lives for freedom, even though he lost ever so much. Philosopher knows themselves, but they have not necessarily chosen themselves. It is in the choosing that one is free. Kierkegaard argues that to know oneself is similar to the way Adam knew Eve, that is, by the means of a sexual intercourse. The Elskov love is implied by this. In this way, Eve was the other for Adam. So, is this self that you're going to know is actually the other to oneself? Therefore, one has to choose oneself, but one has to choose oneself absolutely, because only then the freedom is possible. Similarly, in the Bible verse quoted at the beginning, an absolute is present, the first commandment to love your God. And through that all other love falls into the right place. Their absolute offered here for the student is not God. The student has to come to love oneself rather than the teacher, the subject matter, or as Adam loved Eve. Kierkegaard says that we do not choose either this or that. Quote, I choose absolutely precisely by having chosen not to choose this or that. I choose the absolute. And what is the absolute? It is myself in my eternal validity. Something other than myself I can never choose as the absolute. For if I choose something else, I choose it as something finite and consequently do not choose absolutely. End of quote. He then asks, what is this self of mine? And answers, it is the most abstract of all, and yet in itself it is also the most concrete of all. It is freedom. End of quote. The implication for the students are that they cannot either choose this teacher or that subject. They must choose themselves absolutely in their freedom. At the beginning of the first part of either or, Kierkegaard would say, quote, how unreasonable people are. They never use the freedoms they have, but demand those they do not have. They have freedom of thought, they demand freedom of speech. End of quote. Students like Johannes have to choose oneself by loving oneself, which is achieved by loving thinking. But this is not a selfish love of oneself. Kierkegaard's answer is the same to that of Plato's Phaedrus. There is a paradox present within the love, or in the case of Phaedrus, knowledge of oneself. Quote, self-love lies at the basis of love, Shally-head, but at its peak, its paradoxical passion wills its own downfall. End of quote. So they could love the other. To conclude, the above discussion demonstrated that in the instances when the love is directed outside of oneself, towards the teacher or the subject matter or the student, the love always fails. It becomes a seduction similar to that of Socrates, Don Giovanni, or Johannes the Seducer. If one is serious about the biblical commandment of loving one's neighbor, one has to come to understand what it means to love oneself first. This study of love in Kierkegaard demonstrates that to love oneself is indeed to choose oneself in one's freedom, where this freedom is a freedom of thought. The position advanced in this paper is that love of thinking is indeed education itself. However, the relationship to other individuals or to the subject matter is not unimportant. Rather, the love for those things, similar to the biblical commandment, have to be viewed through an absolute, which is a freedom of an individual to think for themselves by being in love with themselves, through the love of thinking. At the peak of this love's understanding of oneself, the individual will be forced by their thinking to proceed in love to another.